everyone. My name is Amber Gibson, and today we'll be talking about everyone's favorite subject, the relationship between homosexuality and the Christian church. It's going to be a good time. So why should we care about the relationship between homosexuality and the Christian church? Well, if I were to poll this room and ask for a show of hands of anyone who is Christian, knows someone who's a Christian, is gay, or knows someone who's gay, it's likely every single hand in this room would go up. That shows that this topic pertains to everyone. Everyone can learn something from what's demonstrated here today and influence others with what they learn. Oh, fun fact, 75% of people in every room in the United States consider themselves to be a Christian, while 3% of people in every room consider themselves to be gay. So my agenda, I'll present my research question followed by my interdisciplinary rationale. I'll then present my literature review and analysis simultaneously. I'll then go into my methods, limitations, recommendations, followed by my conclusions, and then questions from you all. So what does the Bible really say about homosexuality? Is homosexuality a sin? Is it an abomination? Is homosexuality unnatural? And my research question, how do scholars interpret references to homosexuality in the Bible? We will be answering all of these questions today. So for my interdisciplinary rationale, I have two subject areas. They are psychology and religious studies. For psychology, I primarily focused on cognitive psychology, which is the scientific study of mental processes, primarily as it relates to language use, perception, and how people think. For religious studies, I focused on Christianity and the scripture of Christianity, which is obviously the Bible. I also focused on the cultural and institutional history of Christianity. The integration of these two subject areas is the psychology of religion and the analysis of spiritual belief, which is what we're going to be doing here today. We're going to be analyzing what people believe and why. So my literature review, I have two biblical passages. Both are from the Old Testament and are in Leviticus. One is in 18:22 and the other is in verse 20:13. And I have one verse from the New Testament. It's written by the Apostle Paul and it's in Romans 1:26 through 27. I have scholar interpretation on all of these passages. Sorry, brain freeze. So we'll get right into it. Leviticus 18:22 reads, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." So in reading that, there doesn't appear to be any room for uncertainty as to what this passage is describing regarding homosexual conduct. And that's exactly why it's extremely dangerous to read the Bible out of context. Words are extremely subjective. Words are symbols which relate to ideas. Words are subjective depending on condition, on culture, on circumstance, and on language. I'll give you an example of this. When I say to my sister, "Oh wow, those pants are so tight," compared to when my grandma, for example, says to my sister, "Oh wow, those pants are so tight." This is an example of the exact same words being used, but what we're saying are two completely different things. I'm saying, "Oh wow, those pants are so awesome." What my grandma's saying, however, is, "Oh wow, those pants are way too small." This is an example of the exact same words being used, but the meanings being two completely different things. So what does the writer of Leviticus mean when they use the word abomination? Well, there's a psychological principle that states when you want to know what a person means by a certain word, you have to look at the other ways in which they use that same word. So when I think of an abomination, I think of something horrific, but I'm not the one using the word. I have to look at the other ways in which the writer of Leviticus uses the word in order to determine its significance. Or in this case, it's not so significant, because in Leviticus, the other things coined as abominations include shellfish, the eagle, the seagull, the owl, bacon, the stork, sausage, along with many other unclean phenomena. These abominations are all in reference to cultural standards that were meant to set the Israelites apart from the rest of society, and of course are no longer adhered to by the majority of the modern world. They're no longer adhered to because they're not moral law. They're cultural ideals from a time and place that our society is no longer bound to. Another way context is extremely important is when it comes to the physical placement of words within the text. What's unusual about the location of the 1822 prohibition is that instead of being directly aligned with other sexual bans, it's found sandwiched in between two verses describing extremely horrific cultic behavior. The first verse is a ban against the sacrifice of children to the god Molech, and this was an initiation ritual in which infants were literally passed through fire and then delivered to the pagan priest, obviously killing them in the process. The second verse is a prohibition against men and women having sex with animals, and they did this as an act of idolatry. They had sex with the animal that represented the deity that he or she worshipped, and they did this as a way of becoming closer with that deity. Scholars believe the homosexual verse is sandwiched in the middle to indicate its involvement with these cultic rituals, thereby proving the abomination is not due to the nature of homosexuality itself, but rather to the idolatry, murder, and lust that surrounded cultic worship. The Greek word here for abomination is toava, and in this context, scholars believe that the toava consists of a civil nature rather than an ethical one. Because what biblical writers are discussing in Leviticus are cult practices charged with gruesome, lust-filled sacrifices to a pagan god. They're not the monogamous, ethically bound relationships that we fight for in marriage equality and in social justice. This and homosexual relationships as practiced today are two completely different things. This brings us to Leviticus 20:13, which reads, "If a man lies with a male as he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination," there's that word again, "they shall surely be put to death, their blood shall be upon them." Again, we're gonna go right into how important context is and how important what's written before and after a verse truly is. The placement of 2013's prohibition has led many scholars to believe that the verse is a continuation on the ban against incest rather than homosexual conduct, and I'll explain why. When you have the Greek word mesakebi followed by a kin or gender term, this is known by scholars as a technical term for incest. So mesakebi means to lie down or the lying down of. In our verse we have, if a man lies with a male. We have lies with, which is translated from the Greek word mesakebi. We then have lies with a male, male being a kin or gender term. We have the technical term for incest. What we don't have is a technical term for homosexual conduct. Prior to this, we only have incestual bans from father-son to uncle-nephew. So scholars believe this is a way of encompassing all incestual behavior as immoral instead of just father-son and uncle-nephew. This absolutely affirms the area in which 2013 is placed, and especially accounts for why the two homosexual verses aren't even placed together. They're not only separated by pages, but by chapters. And they're separated so far because they're not meant to represent the same thing. One is meant to represent cultic practice, the other is meant to represent incestual behavior. So that brings us to the holiness code. The context of Leviticus 18:22 and 2013 is set within what many scholars refer to as the holiness code. Scholars point out that anyone reading Leviticus enters into a world far removed from their own. For example, Leviticus 25 details how to buy slaves and pass them on to one's children as an inheritance. Leviticus 19 prohibits the trimming of one's beard and the marking of tattoos. These are instructions completely abandoned by modern culture, and they're certainly not seen as sinful. In fact, in today's society, we have clean shaves, we have free slaves, and we have an abundance of tattoos. But none of these things are preventing people from getting married like the same-sex verses are. And why is that? They're both verses written in the same book, being Leviticus, and in the same book of law, also being Leviticus. Leviticus is a book of law. So what could possibly overturn a law? Well, if you're a part of the 75% of Christians in the room that we discussed earlier, then Jesus came to fulfill the law. And to fulfill means to bring to completion, to achieve or realize. Christ's death fulfills the sacrificial system of the older covenant. In the words of Jesus, it has been finished. And the entire law, according to Jesus, can be fulfilled in keeping one commandment: love thy neighbor as thyself. The entire law. All of these old civil rules and regulations have been fulfilled. They're over and done with. We're no longer slaves to the law. We're no longer slaves to what's written in Leviticus. To prove this point even further, Jesus commands Peter to eat an animal his entire life Peter has been taught is wrong. An animal that's considered an abomination under Levitical law. In Acts 10, 9-16, Jesus commands Peter to eat an animal his entire life he has been taught is wrong. I just said that. For some people, homosexuality is an abomination, just like eating unclean animals was for Peter. Leviticus illustrates them both as abominations under God. Peter's entire life, he had been taught, this is wrong, this is wrong. And why? Because the Bible says it's wrong. And Peter followed that faithfully. Then Jesus comes along and changes everything. And we see that change happen in Acts 10:15. When Peter shows hesitancy and not wanting to eat the unclean animal, Jesus comforts him by saying, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. And it's such a monumental moment. It's said 3 times in succession. And typically when something's repeated, it's because it's meant to be heard. What God has made clean, you must not call profane. So certainly what God has made clean isn't sinful. Certainly what God has made clean isn't an abomination. But is it unnatural? And that's the question that scholars answer next. In Romans 1:26-27, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty for their error, which was due. So like we discussed earlier, a good way of knowing what someone means by a word is looking at the other ways in which they use that same word. And Paul uses the word natural here a lot, especially in regards to that which is against nature. So what does Paul mean when he says something is against nature? Well, in 1 Corinthians 11:14, Paul is using the same word for natural, which is physiken from the Greek word, in the same context, in which he's referring to the shamefulness of long hair on men, calling that against nature. We can now see that what Paul refers to as against nature is in reference to social customs of his day. He's not referring to any sort of morality or ethical law. Scholars also point out in regards to nature that nature evolves, nature moves, nature changes, nature grows. As time passes, nature evolves along with it. If there's anything that's contrary to nature, it's in staying the same. And that brings us to sexual orientation. Everything we know comes from our experience. The only experience Paul and others of that time had with same-sex relationships consisted of cult practices, pedophilia, incest, and sex between masters and their slaves, often while the slave master was married to a woman. Consensual monogamous relationships were few, and they were definitely hidden. What was demonstrated and seen was lustful, sinful, and vile, so it's no wonder Paul is speaking in condemnation of them. He's referring to the same sorts of behaviors we've been discussing from Leviticus. This is an example of how everything comes full circle, how everything aligns, how everything from the Old Testament is then reflected into the New. So for my research methods, I use peer-reviewed journal articles, popular media articles, TED Talks, sermons, and of course, biblical text. Limitations. There are 6 scriptures that directly reference homosexual conduct in the Bible, and what you heard today was only 3 of them. Inherently me. While I tried to be as objective as possible, everything you heard and saw today was influenced through my understanding and filtered through my understanding of what I read and saw while I was doing my research. I also have no formal education in Hebrew or Latin, so I had to trust that what the scholars were interpreting for me was based off truth and fact. There are countless perspectives and interpretations out there. What you heard today was only a handful of them. So my recommendations, don't take my word for it. There are a plethora of other people who know significantly more about this topic than I do. They've written books, they've done TED Talks, they've written journal articles, popular media articles. A quick Google search will bring up an abundance of information. And my other recommendation is, we're only halfway there. Like I said before, we've only done 3 out of the 6 scriptures, so if you're at all interested, I strongly encourage you to research the remaining 3. So in conclusion, based off the literature review as presented today, we have found that the Bible contains no prohibitions against mutually affirming homosexual relationships as practiced today. There are only scattered comments against same-sex abusive Gentile practices, rape, incest, cultic worship, and violence. But these are all context-specific and historically bounded statements. They can hardly be used as justification for prohibiting all loving and committed gay and lesbian relationships today. If you are someone who does still believe that these verses we went over today do directly reference homosexual relationships as they are practiced today, then I will leave you with the words of Jesus, what God has made clean, you must not call profane. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.